Trails of Tears. Choctaw tribes were apparently the first Indian group in the East to migrate west to the Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, pursuant to the 1831 Removal Act that President Andrew Jackson pressed through Congress. Thousands, nearly 1/3 of the Choctaw Nation, died of starvation, exposure, and disease on the more than 500-mile journey. A part of that journey was witnessed by Alexis de Tocqueville. He found himself on the left bank of the Mississippi in 1831. I quote at length de Tocqueville's reminiscence.
One cannot imagine the frightful evils that accompany these forced migrations. At the moment when the Indians left their paternal fields, they were already exhausted and worn down. The country where they go to stay is occupied by small tribes who see the newcomers only with jealousy. Behind them is hunger. Before them is war. Everywhere is misery. In order to escape so many enemies, they divide up. Each of them seeks to isolate himself so as to find furtively the means of sustaining his existence and lives in the immensity of the wilderness, like an outcast in the heart of civilized societies. The social bond, long since weakened, then breaks. Already there is no more native country for them. Soon there will no longer be a people. Families will scarcely remain. The common name is lost. The language is forgotten. Traces of the origin disappear. The nation has ceased to exist. I would not want a reader to be able to believe that my picture here is overcharged. I saw with my own eyes several of the miseries that I have just described. I contemplated evils that would be impossible for me to recount. At the end of 1831, I found myself on the left bank of the Mississippi, at a place named Memphis by the Europeans. While I was at this place, a numerous troop of Choctaws came. The savages were leaving their country and sought to cross to the right bank of the Mississippi, where they flattered themselves they would find the refuge that the American government promised them. It was then in the heart of winter, and the cold ravaged that year with an unaccustomed violence. Snow had hardened the ground, and the river carried along enormous pieces of ice. The Indians brought along their families with them. They dragged behind them the wounded, the ill, infants who had just been born, and the old who were going to die. They had neither tents nor carts, but only some provisions and arms. I saw them embark to cross the great river, and this solemn spectacle will never leave my memory. One heard neither tears nor complaints among this assembled crowd. They were silent. Their misfortunes were old, and they felt them to be irreparable. All the Indians had already entered the vessels that were to carry them. Their dogs still remained on shore. When the animals finally saw that they were going away forever, together they let out frightful howls, and dashing at once into the icy waters of the Mississippi, they followed their masters swimming.
Another native cluster, the Cherokee Nation, after the American Revolution, sought to unite around concepts of governance, echoing those of their recognized masters, the colonials. Settled heavily in the Tennessee Valley, they had widely adopted the Christian teachings of the missionaries embedded amongst them, learned to use white man agricultural techniques, and even could write and read in English. The tribe commanded large tracts of farmland, horses, sawmills, and even slaves. Sequoyah, a Cherokee silversmith, developed what is called a syllabary, linking symbols to sounds in the Cherokee language. The nation wrote its own constitution and set it in application in 1826. 12 years later, though, a block of Cherokee, comprising some 7,000 supporters of what was then called the Treaty Party, set off with a bundle of money in their pocket for the West. Pursuant to the Treaty of New Choctaw in 1835. However, some 18,000 Cherokee did not join. These were then rounded up by thousands of U.S. soldiers and forced into stockades during the summer, after the Senate failed by a single vote to block ratification of the treaty agreement. Dysentery and fevers dispatched some of the prisoners. The captives were allowed to organize themselves into 13 parties, each making, during the winter of 1838 to 39, a 6-month hike out of Tennessee to western lands, mostly Oklahoma, recording a toll of probably 4,000 citizen deaths overall, plus many slaves. Ice choked the Illinois rivers. Internal squabbling and dissension among tribal members added to the misery and discouragement of these proud people. Still, in Oklahoma, finally, they again organized and settled to a relatively peaceable continuance as a people. Their lands back home went to lottery and patent allocations. The lead Cherokee advocate of the removal treaty, called Major Ridge, and some of his family were eventually assassinated in what was considered to be justice according to Indian law, for his perceived betrayal of the well-being of the community. The Cherokee joined the Confederacy during the Civil War. The Potawatomi Trail of Death. At least in the back of the minds of some American colonization strategists in the early 19th century was the realization that the indigenous population in the East was actually increasing in the era of 1760 through roughly 1830. The Potawatomi Trail of Death occurred in the same year as the Cherokee March from the Smoky Mountains to Oklahoma. Colonial militia were empowered to conduct a forced removal in 1838 of about 850 members of the Potawatomi Nation, known as the Yellow River Band, from Indiana to reservation lands in what is now eastern Kansas. That march began at Twin Lakes, Indiana, Myers Lake, and Cook Lake near Plymouth, Indiana, in September, and ended in early November along the western bank of the Osage River near present-day Osawatomie, Kansas. From 1834 to 1837, Abel C. Pepper, Indian agent for northern Indiana, secured what were referred to as the Whiskey Treaty Secessions of Potawatomi reservation lands. As one can surmise from the name, whiskey and spirits were given to get the Indians to sign the document. Chief Menominee, who refused to sign or sell, gathered followers among hundreds of Potawatomi who wished to stay in Indiana. They moved to the chief's village near today's Plymouth, Indiana. One emigration of Potawatomi occurred in 1837, landing near Centerville, Kansas. Squatters promptly seized Potawatomi land in several Indiana counties. General John Tipton was appointed to collect the remaining Indians because of the settlers' rising fear of an uprising. Chief Menominee objected, was tied up, and Potawatomi tribe members living in roughly 30 to 50 mile radius were taken as prisoners. Chief Menominee, Chief Notauka, and Chief Pipinoa rode in a horse-drawn jail wagon across Indiana. Their people walked or rode horseback behind them. Many had been baptized by Father Benjamin Marie Pettit, who was given permission to accompany them. Father Pettit managed to get the chiefs released from their wagon jails and tended to the sick with mostly just tea and sugar. Many died. Father Pettit said Mass every day and baptized the babies who died. Quote,
who with their first step passed from earthly exit to the heavenly sojourn.
The Indians arriving in Kansas in early November discovered that their houses promised them had not been built. Father Pettit stayed for a few weeks but became sick with the fever himself. Father Hecken at Sugar Creek Mission took over, and Father Pettit left for St. Louis, where he died in February. In his own words, Father Pettit wrote,
the order of the march was as follows. 1. The United States flag carried by a dragoon soldier. 2. Then one of the principal officers. 3. Next the staff baggage carts. 4. Then the carriage, which during the whole trip was kept for the use of the Indian chiefs. 5. Then one or two chiefs on horseback led a line of 250 or 300 horses ridden by men, women, and children in single file, quote, after the manner of savages, unquote. On the flanks of the line, at equal distance from each other, were the dragoons and volunteers, hastening the stragglers, quote, often with severe gestures and bitter words, unquote. In the rear followed 40 baggage wagons filled with luggage and Indians. The sick were lying in them, rudely jolted, under a canvas which, far from protecting them from the dust and heat, only deprived them of air, for they were as if buried under this burning canopy. Several died thus.
Benjamin Pettit was buried under the chapel at Notre Dame University. A statue commemorating Menominee stands near Plymouth, Indiana, where his village once stood. In 1909, historian Jacob Platt Dunn called the march the Trail of Death in a book he wrote about Indian stories, and the name has stuck ever since.